So I wanted to take a moment to circle back on something that I participated in about about a year ago, maybe a little bit less. And that was this Jubilee surrounded episode, particularly the one with Candace Owens. I've been in a few of these. In fact, one is set to release pretty soon. That one will certainly be interesting, but Candace Owens was certainly the biggest one I had done. And I wanted to go back, return to this, and actually go through it now that it's been a year out, see just, how well did I articulate my arguments? How well did Candace address them? I do recall her actually liking our conversation and our discussion, which is pretty interesting. And I was hoping in the moment after she had said that she was going to select me for the end. She didn't do that, which is totally fine. But Candace Owens, also, just a side tangent, she's really interesting in the sense that she's defected from a lot of the traditional conservatives and, just the, I guess you could say, establishment GOP political figures. She obviously defects with a lot of Republicans on the issue of Israel and Palestine. She's more sympathetic, supposedly, to the Palestinian cause, although I'm a bit skeptical of her sympathies, to put it lightly. But this was before a lot of her big and major defections. Now she's literally being called out by Donald Trump himself on Truth Social. So this was before a lot of that. This was pretty early. This debate happened, I believe, pretty early into the Trump second term. So this discussion actually ended up being regarding feminism, which I also find interesting because she doesn't seem to talk about that issue, or that's not exactly what she's necessarily known for. I think maybe you could say that early in her political career, but certainly not at this point. She's, more known for perhaps her criticisms of the Trump administration, conspiracy theories regarding, Charlie Kirk's death, or the Prime Minister of France's wife, etc. But this claim was probably one of the most ridiculous surrounded, and there's been quite a few if you're familiar with the series. This was one of the most ridiculous claims. It was she believes that we live under a matriarchy and not a patriarchy. And her reasoning for this, as we'll get into, is that women hold social power, and that, because, for example, because women play such a big role in shaping the cultural discourse and dialogue in this country, because they have so much cultural sway, and because, they lean more progressive, and those sorts of progressive attitudes, intensify or deepen within our culture, that must mean we live in a matriarchy. And this is a failure just as it stands as per the definition of matriarchy versus patriarchy. Men obviously hold far more power in a material sense, but nonetheless, I still found this conversation pretty interesting. So let's go ahead and just jump right into it.
Hi. How are you?
Great to meet you. I'm doing
Very
well.
nice to meet you.
So I view this argument as a matter of fact, right? This is a descriptive claim about the culture, reality we live in, and patriarchy being a system in which men hold the predominance of power in both political, economic, and social methods of organization. So S&P 500 companies, 90% of CEOs are men. Board members, 70% of CEOs are men. 70% of congressional members are men. Now, you may provide some sort of naturalistic argument to why that is, but what you're essentially arguing then is that there's a natural patriarchy.
And so I just want to clarify something, because that was a funny way of pausing it. But I just want to clarify something. Friend of the show, Farha, who I actually just did a podcast with that you should go check out, she kind of teases me for laying out like a sort of definition of patriarchy in my response. But I do take her argument to just be a misrepresentation of what the words patriarchy and matriarchy actually mean. Because if you take patriarchy as what it's been described as through feminists, sociologists, or even just the dictionary definitions, we by definition don't live under a matriarchy. We live in a society that is more akin to a system in which men hold the predominance of power. And that is true even in more Western liberal democracies than, maybe more conservative or oppressive regimes. But it's also important to note that it is a scale, right? We can say that our society is certainly less patriarchal than other societies around the world. And we can also say that our society is less patriarchal than it was 10 years ago, 20 years ago, and certainly 50 years ago. But one thing I also find very interesting about this discussion is you hear a lot of conservatives no longer attempt to actually reject the claim that we live in a patriarchy. They instead attempt to argue that we do live in a patriarchy, but patriarchal order in societal organization is justified. That's sort of the new undertaking with a lot of right-wing debaters and right-wing cultural influencers nowadays. It's no longer a rejection of this term. It's no longer attempting to reject the premises of feminism that we live in an oppressive society against women. They would just attempt to argue that the inequalities are actually justified. And so that's what the sort of dichotomy I lay out here is. The question as to whether or not we live in a more patriarchal system really shouldn't be a question at all, because what her response is going to be to me laying out the facts of the matter as to how we live in a patriarchal system is that she's going to follow that up by justifying that, right? She's going to say that is just a matter of the natural order. But then if you're going to say it's a matter of the natural order, you're not actually dismissing whether or not we live in a patriarchal or matriarchal system. You're just dismissing as to whether or not the system we live in is just in those inequalities.
I think feminists would all disagree with. We think that there's a clear social pressure as to why this is. And part of the evidence for that is since feminism's arise within our public culture, we've now seen an explosion of women entering these fields, but we have a long way to go. But fundamentally, the claim regarding patriarchy or matriarchy, we are so much closer to where we were just a few decades ago or a couple generations ago where women couldn't hold a credit card than a system where men can't hold a credit card. We're still much closer to that form of society.
Why would you say that we're closer to that? What do you mean by that? Did you just qualify that?
Because in terms of economic power, so for example, household wealth, women own 55 cents to every dollar a man owns.
Who controls household spending, though? So we talk about how the money's made in America. How is it being spent? Who spends it?
So it's primarily spent by women, as you've noted, but then the money where the profit's being generated, it's being generated by men.
Would you rather be the people that are spending and deciding on what the money's being spent on, or would you rather be the person that's just working to earn that?
Well, CEOs and board members aren't working. They own the shares and they're making the profit.
Well, when you own profit is making.
You would much in a capitalist system, by definition, you would much rather be making the profit than spending.
I would much rather be spending your money than having to work for your money. Just so we are totally clear here, I would much rather spend your money than have to go out and earn your money.
So this part, I think, is where I almost got tricked up in the sense that I thought she was asking a clarifying question in regards to, would you rather be a consumer being the one who's spending, or would you rather actually own shares of a firm and be generating the profit and own the very wealth that is going into your bank account? And in that sense, in that strict binary sense, in the economic sense, right, of being whether or not you're a capitalist consumer, or a wage laborer and a consumer, or the owner of capital and the owner of businesses, people would much rather own capital and own the businesses, own the wealth. So instead, I ended up getting tricked up on that. Whereas what she was truly suggesting is that because women are predominantly the ones who spend the income of a household, they actually have more of a say and more of the power in the situation, which is actually something that I still would disagree with, because what the women are spending it on is usually things like grocery shopping. It's stuff for the family, right? That when we talk about household spending and that it's being quote unquote controlled or done by women, it's because they've been relegated to the household and they don't have the same sort of financial independence that the man does, because he's the one who's generating the income and also often the one that can leave and keep his career and all of the financial assets he's generated or created.
You're talking about wage laborers in terms of working, but in terms of
no, I'm speaking about spending power, right?
Yeah,
well,
yeah, well, sure, okay,
but that matters. If 85%
sure.
of 85 cents of every dollar, how that's being spent, is being determined by women, that's power. That we can't say spending power is not
why,
power.
Why do you think that is the case? It's because women are often relegated to the role of doing grocery shopping, et cetera. Because for millennia now, or from millennia up until now, women were unable to enter the workforce and have economic, political freedom.
So let's get into the reasons, because you brought up something, that men are the people that are at the top of these companies, these Fortune 500 companies.
Right. And political power.
You're absolutely right. Why is that?
It's primarily because the women haven't broken the ceiling quite yet in terms of meeting men in terms of parity with these sort of powers. But what we've seen with the explosion of feminism is that women have actually begun to enter these companies, have risen into both political and economic positions of power. But that continues to grow year by year, which shows that these social pressures are actually breaking apart as soon as feminism comes into play.
So what I would say is what that shows you is that women and men have different interests. And I think this gets into what I was saying, that just because you see a disparity does not mean that it's not just a disparity in what our interests are. That's what's being represented. I don't know why there has been this idea that women should want to aspire to work 80 hours a week in order to be on par with men.
Do you think that interests are innate, or do you?
So before I let myself respond, because I'm going to get into the fact that she expresses the fact that because there are more men in these sorts of roles, it must just mean that men and women have different interests at our most fundamental level. But I actually want to note something that she just said earlier before I get into that. Is she said, I don't know why women would want to aspire to work 80 hours a week just to be on par with men, right? And she actually makes these sorts of suggestions throughout this entire episode. She's like, why are we encouraging women, for example, to take on a ton of debt, to go through college, barely make enough to actually pay off that debt, or not be able to pay off that debt at all, and essentially burden themselves with the economic woes that any financially independent person in this country has to go through. And the issue with this is that it's not this strict binary. We can still advocate for economic development, economic freedom. We can advocate for a robust social safety net. We can advocate for good labor unions and labor protections to ensure that people are earning enough and making a living wage so that they don't have to go through these economic burdens, but that women can also do that with financial independence, because men do not want to take on a ton of debt and work 80 hours a week just to make ends meet either. Men are not loving the life of sitting at a cubicle for 8 hours a day, 40 days a week, right? That is not optimal for human flourishing and human life, okay? Even for men. It's not natural for men to want to generate a profit for somebody else. People broadly are going to be driven in a broad sense to maybe provide for themselves, provide for their family, or work hard at something in service of a greater end, or something that they're very passionate about. But that's not the same thing as just endlessly and tirelessly working and fundamentally being exploited for your labor, right? And so she misconstrues that feminists just want men to have, she misconstrues that women just want to have the same sort of economic burdens as men, when that's not the argument. The argument is that nobody should have these economic burdens, hence why feminists often advocate for economic justice on that very front, but that also people, both men and women, should be able to satisfy their lives through independence.
You think
I think the interests are innate.
So why is it then that...
Sorry, here, let me rewind really quick.
think that
that
interests are innate, or do you think
I
that
think the
social
interests are innate.
So why is it then that, for example, in the 1980s, only a quarter of college graduates were women, where now majority of college graduates are women? That shows that because of the way that social pressures have actually changed, women's interests are actually now changing too. A majority, I think, or at least half of law school graduates are now women. It used to be the case in, for example, a few hundred years ago, that a lot of primary philosophers like Immanuel Kant, Hegel, didn't even believe women could be reasonable. Now, here you are today doing a debate with me where we're using logic and reason to get to these flows, and nobody here would dismiss the claim that you can't be rational or logical or be, for example, a great lawyer because you're a woman.
Right.
So I just want to note something of where this discussion has gone, because we went from discussing whether or not we live in a patriarchy versus a matriarchy. I laid out what a patriarchy is by its very conceptual understanding, how exactly our society comports with a patriarchy. And now the conversation, as I expected, has gone from not from I reject the claim that the society we live in comports with that conception of a patriarchy, but instead the way that society is organized and the inequalities amid society are actually natural and justified because of women's innate interests. And so now what the discussion has gone through is now a discussion as to whether or not women have innate interests that just preclude them from being on par with men when it comes to things like economic and political power, right? And so what I just did there is demonstrate that we're actually still continuing to see growth, that as soon as social pressures have changed and we don't have the same sort of societal pressures, both societal and legal pressures, that isolated women into a confined box of needing and requiring a man for their income and needing and requiring to just simply stay home and raise a family, as soon as those social barriers break apart, the outcomes do not flip overnight, but they're gradually and progressively deteriorating, right? It used to be the case, as I just noted, a few hundred years ago, even big philosophers like Kant and Hegel believed women could not be rational. That was a fundamental assumption, not just throughout the broad portions of society, but philosophers, like genuinely smart people, thought this as well. And now we live in a day and age where, you know, being a lawyer or law school broadly is something that women are doing at even a higher rate than men. And in order to pass the LSAT with a good score, you need to know logic. So we do know that women can be rational. That was a built-in assumption that we had for hundreds of years that just was proven wrong by simply allowing women to pursue something like law as a career.
So I totally agree with you that women, but I think they have actually entered into the workforce. I mean, entered into college under this external pressure of feeling that if you don't go to college, you're going to be a failure.
So you admit
and
that
knowing
pressures
that
are a part of the way interests work.
Yes, but we're disagreeing on where the pressure is coming from. Like, I think that now the pressure is that if a woman doesn't enter the force, there's no longer this idea that, okay, we're going to come together as a family, whereas there was this reality that there was this understanding that you would have a partner. People were getting married when they were 18, 19 years old.
Right.
Our grandparents, now it's because of feminism. And I'm saying this is the downside of feminism. Women no longer have that sense. They think that they have to be pressured to go take out a loan to go to college, and then you have the pressure to get.
Well, they have the same pressures as men because women no longer rely on it for an income.
Pause.
And I nailed it there right at the end, right? Because she's saying, okay, I admit now that social pressures do affect behavior. Right? Because at first, when I brought up the fact that men hold the predominance of wealth economically, they're overrepresented in our political system, they're overrepresented when it comes to economic power, her first inclination was just to say that is based on our natural interests. And any inequality can be explained by someone's natural interest because women are just naturally less inclined to take those positions of power. But then I demonstrated that no, natural interest doesn't actually shape these sorts of statistics, because these sorts of statistics have been changing along with society. So social pressures are actually the way that interests can change, right? Somebody can be interested in a career because of the sorts of representation they see within people around them, right? So then once I demonstrate that social pressures have actually changed, then she reverts to admitting that social pressures are influencing human behavior and women's interests, but the social pressures are these economic pressures that are new to women. Well, of course, they're new to women because women no longer rely on men for an income. Women now share and have the same sorts of economic and social pressures men do. Not in every sense, right? Which is why these sorts of inequalities are progressing and haven't met parity. And for many of them, you know, we can even say that they never will meet parity. Perhaps there are some natural behavioral inclinations, right? So perhaps there is maybe some fundamental personality differences that are rooted in hormones that will broadly align based on gender and sex, right? That's okay. But we are certainly not at a state where we can say all the inequalities are just fundamental and natural and can't be altered through social pressures. That's certainly not the case, because we're still continuing to see these inequalities break apart year by year. And so it was a little frustrating, obviously, with the way this this debate format is structured. It's done so in a way where you have to get very quick with getting through your points. And something I've noticed about Surrounded being on a few of these is you're rewarded in the circle for dominating the conversation. So if I were to have been more aggressive with Candace, I would have been more likely rewarded in the circle, in the sense that people would have been less inclined to vote me out because they want to see someone aggressively and passionately defend their views. But for listeners at home, people want to see more of a back and forth. So it's a balancing act of attempting to do both. I'm very interested to see what the next Surrounded video, which is set to come out this upcoming weekend, is going to be like. So be sure to stay tuned for that, because I will be doing a discussion on that with a dear friend who was on that video as well. And I'll be doing maybe a few more of these as well. So let me know if you enjoyed this sort of recap, this sort of breakdown of any of my previous debates on Jubilee. I'm happy to do them. And if you enjoy this sort of content, be sure to subscribe. Appreciate it, guys, and peace out.